Chapter 13 of The Escape of a Princess Pat by George Pearson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Traitor at Vehnmoor. Gießen is in Hesse. Shortly after this we were all sent to Cellelager in Hanover. This was the head camp of a series reserved for the punishment of the working prisoners. Each unit retained the name of Cellelager and received in addition a number, as Cellelager I, Cellelager II, and so on. There were grounds here providing a lot for football, and a theatre run by the prisoners, for which there was an entrance fee, and other like amusements. These, however, were only for those prisoners who were on good behavior, and who were employed there. As such, they were denied such desperadoes as ourselves. We remained there for 2 weeks, and were then sent to the punishment camp known as Vehnmoor, or Cellelager VI. This was a good day's ride away, and also in Hanover, 15 kilometers from the big military town of Oldenburg. Here we were turned out to work on the moors, with 400 Russians, 100 French and Belgians, and 200 British and Canadians. We were housed in one large hut, built on a swamp, and were continually wet. There were only 2 small stoves for the 700 men, and we had only a few 2-pound syrup tins in which to cook. A poor quality of peat was our only fuel, and only 5 men could crowd around the stove at a time. One's chances were rather slim in the dense mob, every man jack of whom was waiting to slip into the first vacant place that offered. We slept in a row along the wall, with our heads to it. Overhead a broad shelf supported a similar row of men. Above them were the windows. At our feet, and in the center of the room, there was a 2-foot passageway, and another row of men with 2 shelves housing 2 more layers of sleepers above them. Then another 2-foot passageway, the row of men on the floor against the other wall, and the usual shelf full above them. The vermin were bad and presented a problem until we arranged with the Russians to take one end to themselves, the French and Belgians the middle, and we were the other end. By this means the British were able to institute precautionary measures amongst ourselves, so that after feasting on the Russians and finishing up on the French, our annoying friends usually turned about and went home again. The swamp water was filthy, full of peat, and only to be drunk in minute quantities at the bidding of an intolerable thirst. There was no other water to be had, and we simply could not drink this. The Russians did, which meant another fatigue party to vary them. The only doctor was an old German, called so by courtesy, but he knew nothing of medicine. As a corporal, I was held responsible for 20 men. That implied mostly keeping track of the sick, and I have seen 19 of my 20 thus. But that made no difference. It was raus, and out they came, sick or well. Every morning an officer stood at the gate as we marched out into the moor, to take eyes right and a salute, for no useful purpose that we could see except to belittle a British soldier's pride. As corporal, I was supposed to give that command to my squad, but rather than do so, I took my stripes down, although that ended my immunity as a non-com from the labor or cutting peat. Others, I am sorry to say, were glad to put the stripes up, and at times went beyond the necessities of the situation in enforcing their rule on their comrades. It was one of those who was found to be trading in and selling his packages to his less fortunate comrades, and who was ostracized in consequence. There were here at Vehnmoor, as there had been in Gießen, a certain few of our men who traded on the misfortunes of their own comrades. This man was the worst of them all. He was a sergeant major in a certain famous regiment of the line in the British Army. He was a fair sample of that worst type which the army system so often delegates authority to, and complains because that authority does not meet with the respect it should on the part of its victims. He excelled in all the arts of sycophant. The pleasure of the guards was his delight, their displeasure his poignant grief. He assumed the authority of his rank with us. He reported the slightest of misdemeanors amongst us to the guards, and was instrumental in having many punished. These and other things gave him and others of his kidney the run of the main grounds, so that they could stretch their legs and have some variety in their lives. Such liberty was far more for any man who would do as they do. None of us were safe from those traitors. The sergeant major in particular spied on us, reporting all criticisms of our guards and other things German. We raged. He had for his virtue a small room to himself in a corner of the hut. When parcels came from England, addressed to the senior non-commissioned officer of his regiment for him to distribute, he called the guards in. Shortly they went out with their coats bulging suspiciously. We were then called to receive ours, whilst he stood over, bullying us with all the abusive chatter which the British service so well teaches. And afterwards we watched covertly, with all the cunning of the oppressed, and saw him receive other stealthy favors from the guards that were not within his arrangement with the commandant. So one of his own men, who had a certain legal learning, took down all these facts as I have recited them, and, calling us together, bade us sign our names in evidence of so foul a treachery, which we gladly did. And it was and is the prayer of all that, when the gates of prison camps roll back, this document will get over to the War Office, and there receive the attention it deserves. My comrades in misfortune here told me of another such a man, who had gone away just before my arrival at this camp. He, too, was a sergeant major of a line regiment in the old army. I had known him in the old days in India. In his own regiment he was never known by his own name, but instead by this one, the dirty bad man. No one ever called him anything else when referring to him. That was his former record, and this is what he did here to keep the memory of it green. He was instrumental in having fixed on us one of the most terrible of army punishment. It appears that some time before one of our men had broken some petty rule of discipline, and the Germans had asked the sergeant major what the punishment was in our army for such a crime, as all offenses are termed in the army. Number 1 field punishment, or crucifixion, had been his lying reply. That meant being spread-eagled on the wheel of a gun limber, tied to the spoke at wrist and ankle, with the toes off the ground and the entire weight of the body on the outraged nerves and muscles of those members. Lacking a gun limber, the Germans used a post with a crossbar for the man's case. After that, this was a recognized mode of punishment for many petty offenses in this camp. It is true that this form of punishment is a part of the so-called discipline of our army, but it was not meted out for offenses of the nature of this man's, and if it had been, the obvious thing for the sergeant major to have done would have been to have lied like a man, instead of which he piled horror on horror for his own countrymen. I have the facts and names of those cases. There will be many strange tales to come from these camps in the fullness of time. No doubt some will go against us, but the truth must be told at all costs, else the evil goes on and on. We were sent out one day to dig potato trenches on the moors in the terrible rain. We stuck our spades in the ground and refused. The guards had French rifles of the vintage of 1870, which carried cartridges with bullets that were really slugs of lead. They began to load. A little ultra-officer tugged excitedly at his holster for the revolver. A big Canadian stepped up. "Wait a minute, mate." He reached down to the little man's waist and drew the gun. He offered it to its owner, butt forward. "Now, go ahead and shoot, and we'll chop your damned heads off." The rest of us confirmed our leader's statement by gathering around threateningly and making gruesome and suggestive motions with our spades. There were 200 of us and only 40 guards. We meant business, and they knew it. They took us back to the larder and locked us up. The following night, that of January 22nd, our guards were reinforced by 30 more. End of chapter 13.